welcome to the Property Trio. As always, I'm joined by my two co-hosts, the inimitable Mike Mortlock and the
I'm waiting
marvellous Cate Bakos.
Don't think anyone's ever wanted to imitate me, Dave. I'm sure it's doable, but I'll be inimitable to start with. I'm looking forward to this one. We've got some meat on the bones today. Yeah.
We do.
For better or worse.
Yeah. How are you, Cate?
I'm well, Dave. It was great seeing you on the weekend. That was fun.
It was
good
fun
50th.
catching up with you guys. Yeah, that was a great 50th down at Agostina.
Nice big long lunch and fair few wines, and then let's go up to the rooftop and have another wine. Famous last words. What babysitter?
Thankfully, I only had one. Got home in a decent hour.
Yeah.
So today's episode, we're tackling a listener questions. So we might just tackle one, or we might be able to get through two. So our first one is from Melissa, and Melissa, firstly, she says she loves the show and thinks we are fabulous. She loves Kate's optimism and is in awe of our command of data. So thanks very much for those kind words, Melissa. So Melissa's currently completing a home construction project that has run into some delays. And so her questions are, what advice would we give to those who have construction loans and the build is dragging on and they're being squeezed between increasing rents, increasing interest rates and increasing construction costs? And what advice would you give to anyone considering a construction loan? So firstly, I'll start with you, Cate. What are some of the challenges that can delay the completion of a build?
Oh, my goodness, where do I start? I feel your pain, Melissa. We're going through a build at the moment. We've got so much regulatory red tape, and I speak about Victoria because I haven't built in New South Wales, but I know across the board, some of these regulations are just onerous and repetitive, and the smallest changes to your plans can send you back to council and back to planning, and it can be really tough. Also, just the sheer delay associated with getting through each stage gate. You have a regulated period of time that you've got to complete things in, but it doesn't feel like it's even-handed at the other side. Sometimes it can take months to get a response out of your planner. And of course, the more overlays and controls that you're working to, the tougher it can get. So there are enormous challenges. The real question is how to combat them, because once you're out of a property and you're paying rent, you've got holding costs associated with your land, and then you're watching the increased building costs from labour and materials starting to skyrocket. It can get really distressing. And we will talk about some of the things that, are ideal world situations, but challenges don't just stem from council and planning authorities. They're also directly related to tradespeople, and having that consistent lineup of trades and making sure that no one gets the house of cards to come down. I watch Ian planning out with precision all of the various steps. You've got to have this person in before this person, then you've got to get the plumbers back, then you've got to get the sparkies in, and you've got to make sure your plaster is there on time. All that stuff, all you need is one person to say, sorry, mate, I've got a delay, or they don't answer their phone, or they've got a bigger job that's been held up, whatever. Then it's like setting off a chain of dominoes, and you've got to reshuffle everybody. So if anyone's thinking it would be fun to start a build, you've really got to listen to this app.
Yeah, 100% really well answered there, Cate. Mike, what are some of the flow-on effects of a delayed construction?
Well, the flow-on effect really is costs, right? So it's going to be cost of, what are you doing while that construction phase is happening? You're paying bank interest, and you might, let's say you're building your home, you might be having to rent. So it's really something that we see a lot in the industry, is that, all contracts typically will have a liquidated damages that basically says there's a cost per day or a cost per week of for every day that you're going past the contract period, which really sort of starts triggering from practical completion. So often we see people just putting 0 or before crossing that out. So there's actually really kind of no recourse for the extended costs. And of course, if there's a 12-month construction program, there might be insurances on that project that last for a month that then roll over into having to have a new policy. So you can actually incur extra costs. There shouldn't really be variations to materials or labour costs. So, for example, you would, if you're on a fixed price contract rather than a cost plus contract, then there should be just a fixed amount. Now, of course, during COVID, we saw builders going under because of these fixed price contracts and then material costs soaring. So there are provisions within contracts to have a provision for construction, the total package to be lower or higher, but that's not particularly typical. But then the builder will normally have a list of sublet trades where they have a package of works that they have to deliver for a fixed price. So the builders kind of want the up and down variation to you, the consumer, but they typically don't have that with the trades. So there shouldn't be any additional costs with the trades. So it is really just what costs money with it taking longer. You're going to have to pay more in interest, and you've got the relocation costs or a loss of rent if it's an investment property.
Yeah. And I guess if potentially you're building a small time development that you plan to sell, the market can move in the meantime. And, if the market moves, that can potentially risk the timing of your selling and trying to sell into a declining market because, the market's different to what you expected it to be by the time you completed it.
True.
Cate, are there any other risks when taking on a construction that we haven't outlined already?
Yeah, Mike obviously hit the big one on the head, and that's cost. But overcapitalisation is a big risk.
Yeah.
Also, trades that walk off the job is a big risk. So for anyone who's ever tried to call in another trade to finish someone else's work, it's near on impossible, especially when there's invisible work that they can't verify, because the trade person that signs off the work and issues the certificate is warranting that the work is good. So you've got to keep your trades on side and make sure if you're doing an owner-builder job or you're managing trades that they start and finish the job properly. Now, if someone doesn't finish the job properly, or if you've done works yourself without permits, you're also risking what we call a show cause or an order on the property. That can be very distressing, very stressful, and highly devaluing. And then the last one, I think, is material cost surcharges, because you can talk about fixed price contracts, but not all items are fixed on every contract. And particularly if you're managing your own build, there'll be items that you can't store or don't want to order until the time is right. And you might have scoped those products, and of course, a year later, they're 40% higher in this kind of climate. So they're just some of the issues. Other risks relate to the land and the land use. You've got to be very, very clear what you're working around. So if you've got heritage overlays, or if you've got environmental audit overlays, or anything that you need to sidestep and get special permission or change your plans for, that all of that is taken into consideration.
Yeah, and I guess the final one is the risk of stress, basically.
Yeah. Relationship risk.
Relationship risk. Happy kids
funny,
risk.
Not funny.
Yeah. And, depending on how involved you are in the project, just the time that it chews up, which can impact, obviously, those things, but then also your own work. If you happen to run a business, that can have a major impact. And if you're an employee, it obviously can as well. So, that also can be risky. If you're renting also, there might be, it's not an easy time to find a rental. And if you've got a set sort of lease, time, and you're unable to renegotiate that, and you might have to move again. So that's probably another thing that might be on Melissa's mind. So, yeah, there are a lot of different factors that can come into it. And I think it's best to set your expectations at the start that it will be stressful, but it's also why you want to sort of get clear, okay, what are all these risks up front, and try and mitigate them, but also understand that they might rear their ugly head during the process and not be surprised by them. Because often when we're surprised by something in life, that's what, because we weren't expecting it, that's what causes us great stress. Mike, do you have any other advice for someone in a position where the build is dragging on and they're feeling the pinch, like Melissa is, of increasing rents, increasing interest rates, and increasing construction costs?
It's a tricky one, because really all of the work ought to be done at the contract period, right? When the contract is being drafted. Whereas if you're in the middle of a contract, there might be some protections or provisions you've neglected that would be great to rely on. But there's normally two reasons why construction programs are delayed. One is resourcing. So, for example, there might be a number of projects that builder has, and there could be one particular one where they have an agreement for a bonus for early completion, or it might be that they're so close to a milestone payment that can actually help to cash flow the rest of the jobs. So resourcing is a big one. The other one is costs and cash flow. So, for example, there might be to the point where they believe they're due a milestone payment, but because of the way the contract is set up, well, at lockup stage, traditionally we didn't have garage doors, 50 years ago. So now they tend to be right at the end, so they don't get damaged. So they might not necessarily be installed at lockup, and the builder's kind of saying, well, I've done everything else except the garage door, so give me 95% of that milestone payment. And a quantity surveyor would say, no, well, this is the terms of the contract. You signed it, you agreed to it, you just didn't read the bloody thing. So I would.
There are always fun moments as a mortgage broker where
yeah.
the client is going, hang on, why can't I have my money? The builder is asking me for the money, and the quantity surveyor and the bank comes back with that, and then the broker's got to have that difficult conversation, and then the customer has to have it with the builder, and sometimes the builder won't agree with what the customer's saying, and they're hearing it through a third party, and it can get quite tricky.
My best advice would be to request either a sit down with the builder, or at the very least an updated program to say, look, this is where we're at. These are the milestones. This is where we're expected to be by this date. And then, of course, you can hold them to that contract to some degree. You can get a lawyer involved to say, look, we're going to issue them a show cause letter to say, look, this is delaying and doesn't appear to be on track. And often those things can be enough to get you back humming along, is that they know they've got a client that is really interested in the progress of this build, and suddenly you might find some trades popping up. But if it really, really drags on, for the same reason that Cate was talking about being able to certify the work and trades leaving site, I would be trying to collect a list of all of the trades. There should be a list of sublet trades on that job, so you can request a list of that, because that builder could go under, that builder could walk away, and then you're left with that situation where a new builder comes in, all those trades have disappeared because there's a risk that they weren't going to get paid, or they've just got other things to get on, and you don't know who they are. Ideally, you want the same people to come back, because otherwise, if they're invisible things, their price is going to be massive, because it has to cover the liability or the potential liability for defective works from the previous person. That's why banks tend to use quantity surveyors, because they want to maintain a cost to complete, and their worst scenario is that another builder has to come in, or the bank has to take on that project, because it's just the cost blowouts around that liability are massive. So I would be getting the list of the trades, I would be getting an updated program and having a sit down with them and saying, look, this is where I expected that we should be. What can we do to get this back on track, or at least not slip further?
Yeah. And you think you could ask the builder for that directly from, the builder should have that list ready, and also probably the scheduled plan in a bit more detail of the timing of who's going to do what and when. And so, try and get that information from the builder, save you having to put it all together. But again, it comes down to the more you dot the I's and cross the T's and get, that plan in place, probably have your own spreadsheet off to the side before you start, the less surprises you're going to have along the way. And that's a big time investment, big time investment. We wrote a few property plans for developers, and, that was a significant process for us. When I say developers, I mean small-time developers, just building, 2 or 3, mums and dads building a 2 or 3, 4 size development. But there's a lot to consider when you put all that together. And they were probably, I don't know, 20 to 40 hour investments of our time just putting something together for them. And, so as someone who's completing a build for yourself, I would say you need to spend more time than that just in the planning phase of what you expect to transpire. Who are all the trades? How much are they going to cost? What is it they're doing, et cetera, et cetera.
And Cate was sort of touching on some of the almost like pre-construction issues, and that's a whole other show for mine. But one thing that has come out from a recent study, 2 universities joint ventured on a study to talk about defects, because obviously there's been a lot of attention on defects, and they found that really 60% of the defects originate from the design phase, and that could potentially be people not wanting to pay the full package to the architect. So there's a lesser level of design, so builders are going to have to get on site and go to figure out, well there's no actual engineering plan for how to build this particular thing. So we're going to have to perhaps add in a beam that we weren't considering. They have to spend some time on site. So those often increase.
Yeah. So what are some examples? Like, is it the angle? Is it, something like a beam, structural beam wasn't considered? What can you give some examples of what might get missed?
Yeah.
In the design phase if it's not done properly?
Yeah, well, it's normally structural things. So it could be, some detail in engineering for the roof. It could be the way that certain corners are designed, and there's just no schedule of how that's to be done. So that requires some on-site problem solving, which is not necessarily factored in to the costs, and could delay the program. So these things can be rushed, and people trying to problem solve on site inevitably it ends up in an increase in defects. So that was really interesting to see that really 60% can be attributed to design.
It's a big number.
I can imagine. Think about those things like energy efficiency ratings that have consistently hiked up, and even things like fire rating, and many properties are impacted at some degree by the need for fire rated materials. And if they're not in the initial design, then when you have your inspector coming along to have a look, they'll pick up on all of this stuff.
Yeah, and I guess the better the design, the less likelihood in theory that the owners will want to make changes as they go along.
Yeah.
So that probably plays into it as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily the quality of the designing, it's the level of detail of that design that's the problem.
Yeah, and probably the level of detail will intersect with the level of thought for the vision of what's to be built that the owners have put into it as well. That's good. Just thinking about this for our next stage of our
yeah.
Cate, what advice would you give to anyone considering a construction loan?
I think once you've got your broad costings and you've got a design in mind, you should be speaking with your financier and a strategic mortgage broker who's got great experience with construction lending is critical. You need someone who can explain it to you really well, because it's not like a normal loan. You have drawdown payments and they're contingent on an inspection. And so you're thinking about your inspector being, someone from the planning department or building assessor, and you're also having to deal with a bank valuer. And these steps can get so misunderstood. And like you said earlier, it's all hell breaks loose when the builder asks for the next instalment, but the bank isn't on the same page, and you've signed a contract without understanding what stages are critical stages. And I also think that anyone who goes into this with a minimum deposit and cap in hand all the way is asking for trouble, because there'll be variations, delays, little delays between bank inspector going through and builder asking for things. And the last thing you want to do is upset your builder. The risk is having them walk off the job and then add further delays to your project. So I think that my overarching advice is, if it's a simple residential construction loan, it's not simple. get really good advice and be very clear. And if it's a multi-unit development, don't assume that resi rules apply, and you absolutely need a specialist there, because that involves more than progress payments and drawdowns. That involves balance sheets and having funds set aside, and you're running the business as a developer. You'll be open to all of the scrutiny that the banks will put a developer through, and you need someone on your side who can answer all of your questions, and you need really good cash flow and really good surplus.
Yeah, great tips, Cate. And builders are actually getting more picky at the moment, so they're looking for evidence of pre-approval before they even go to the next stage of sorting out the contract. At the moment, our brokers are finding, so that's causing a bit of a problem, because in order to get pre-approval, you need the as-if completion valuation.
Yep.
But that rests on the contract, so it's sort of a bit of a chicken and egg situation. So the moment, like we're saying to some of our clients, that they need to ask for the draft contract, and then we can organise an as-if completion valuation before they sign the contract, to ensure the valuation stacks up and they can borrow what they need to borrow. So that obviously is more relevant for people who maybe are closer to a certain LVR level or a certain borrowing capacity level. But that's one thing we're seeing at the moment.
And Dave, these as-if completion values, are they subject to change if the project goes on for a long time? Let's say the market deteriorates.
Yeah, I've never seen it, but there probably is a timeline in there. I imagine it. I'm not certain, but I imagine there's probably a 12-month timeline before that would need to be evaluated. So that would, that is another potential risk there.
Yeah.
Before we move on to listener question 2, which I think we should have time for, is there anything else either of you'd like to share for Melissa's situation?
I was going to say, Dave, we do this for a living. Is we're appointed by homeowners and banks to estimate construction values and make sure that they're tracking along. So, I was chatting to my business partner, Marty, who really heads up that team, and he said if he was doing a development, he would be wanting to sign 2 separate contracts. So he would structure an early works package, which covers up to slab stage, because, there's no kind of liability for the works after that's signed off. It's like a good point. And then, he would be inclined to sign the 2 contracts, but it was based on, completion of that slab at a particular point in time. So it shows evidence that they're able to maintain and track to a program. But I think the best way to approach it is do it.
Advice.
Yeah, you want to do it like a bank does it, right? So a bank will require an independent estimate from a quantity surveyor to say, look, this is the contract that's signed, but we actually think that it won't cost that much to build, or we actually think that there's not enough money in the budget and we need to understand it. Then, of course, we're making sure that everyone is appropriately licensed. We're getting stat decks from tradies to say that they're paid, because obviously if there's cash flow issues, then tradies can be kind of dragged along, making sure all of the insurances and the certificates and licenses are in place, and then that it's tracking to program, and that the payments are dedicated to specific milestones that have to be satisfied. So, it's one of those things where people sometimes look at the costs. It's a bit like the architect. Oh, do you want the 12 grand package or the 20 grand package? Well, maybe that in that $8,000 is where some of that 60% of defects because of levels of design actually lives. So sometimes it's really worth paying for that protection and that coverage, but there's often a resistance at the residential level to take that kind of advice.
Yeah, there is, isn't there? It's an interesting one. The psychology around that causes us to maybe shortcut on the architectural design for the $8,000, but then we end up adding an extra $30,000 or $50,000 onto the build costs along the way, or
saving
if
a
we're
few
in
cents, but risking a lot of dollars.
Every real construction project that we've come into, from sort of the midpoint or the during point, we can see how much we could have impacted that from being engaged from the beginning, and that's painful, it's shameful, and often it gets to expert witness where, the fees are just absolutely ridiculous once you're going to court for construction projects. I mean, we've been involved with an $80,000 retaining wall that exceeded $200,000 in legal costs, right? Now, because sometimes people just want to be right and they want to win, and you get two alphas in the mix, and, it's just crazy. So, look, I really think get the advice, protect yourself up front so that you're not in a position where you've actually kind of got no recourse to help push things along.
So in that bit of advice that you're saying from Marty, did you say that suggest getting a stat deck that each of the trades have been paid by the builder?
Well, that's something that's something that quantity surveyors do as part of the progress claims. So the developer will submit a claim to the bank to say, look, we're at this particular stage of the development, and of course we'll cost it up to say the total package of works is X, but at this point, let's say the slab stage, there's 200 grand in the budget for the slab stage, because otherwise you can have contracts where the builder is front loading those milestones. So a builder would have you think that concrete is expensive and landscaping is the cheapest thing on earth. The landscapers are paid $1 an hour, the concrete is $1,000 an hour, right? Because if you can put that money up front, then you're really kind of cash flowing that development. But that's where an independent person is actually saying, well, no, like this is what the value is and this is what we are going to release. And it's based on works fixed to site as well, because things like windows can be delivered to site and then they can be stolen. So, there can be a gap between it there. So our job is to really protect the bank if we're working for the bank in that instance, or the homeowner that's or the developer that's getting that work done through the builder and the financier.
It's actually interesting you say that. The one bit of feedback from our brokers was that the builders are trying to front end load the contracts,
and
charging more in the earlier stages to cover some costs that have gone up, or potentially because costs have been going up. And that's also a risk because some lenders, you have to have a set percentage in terms of the stages. It can't be flexible. It's got to meet their set percentage structure. So, they're certainly seeing what you just described in the real world with the builder.
You don't want to over release, right? Because if something happens, then you're getting someone in to do the remainder of the works. Well, not only have you got someone that has to take on the liability of the where we're at, but also it was over released to that point as well. So that's kind of like, that's two areas where you're underdone.
Yeah. Is there anything you can put into show notes with perhaps this ideal way to approach it, or how a quantity surveyor approaches? Do you have some sort of document you can share with our listeners in show notes?
ChatGPT will whip something up.
Yeah, see what we can do. I'll download a prompt.
Just added some more work for you.
With the MCG colours.
Yeah.
No, that's all right.
We can always delete that out.
I think I've got one little bit to share, and that is we've talked about the really daunting elements, and I think if you talk to anyone who's built for the first time, they'll resonate with all of this. So I don't want to dim it down. It is a very serious thing to take on, and losses are at stake. But what I do want to say is when you finish your build and you're happy with it and your marriage is still intact and you're then enjoying your property, it's a pretty special feeling. But more so, you'll learn so much along the way. I think to insulate yourself and mitigate the risks, it's just having good people around you. Listen to good advice, source the right people, get some introductions, have a strategist that can talk to you about the money side of things and know exactly what they're talking about and explain it to you so that you understand it, and demand that. If you're not getting it, you've got the wrong person.
Yeah, great advice, Cate.
So, Dave, I know you're host today, but I've got a couple of questions specifically for you, because a lot of listeners will be listening into this and wondering, well, what sort of segments of construction lending are there? There's house and land, there's owner builder, there's single dwelling, multi-unit dwelling, there's large developments, and they're all pretty different. Can you just give us an overview of how that feels for you as a mortgage broker running a firm that talks to people doing constructions every day? What are your first questions and next steps?
Probably the first questions are understanding what's your current total property values? What's your current total debt? Working out the equity, what they've got to play with. Then obviously how much they expect the construction to cost. Now, if it's for a home, like if it's a knockdown and rebuild, what do they estimate the end value will be? Is that realistic? What would, if your current value is X, what part of that would the dwelling make up? Because you're about to demolish that. So we need to get an estimate of what the actual land value is. There's often the valuation won't be just land value plus construction equals end value. Often it'll come back less than the current land plus construction. So we try it, do they have comparable sales that they can look at on what they're going to build? What about if they take off 5% or 10%? Are we still going to be able to be under 80% loan to value ratio if they reduce the value, their estimated valuation by 5 or 10%? Because often people overestimate the value.
Yeah.
I don't know if hopefully I'm not going too quick here.
No, this is good.
Points. So ultimately, it really is like, if that's saying for a home build and you knock down, you're doing a total new build, is like, is it feasible? Let's just start with the numbers. Can you get it done within the equity and the serviceability levels that you have? And how realistic are we being? And if it's going to be tight at 80%, or if you're going to 90 or 95%, we have to put more things in place, like actually getting a copy of the contract, potentially unsigned, getting that valuation done before we even get started. So they might be some of the things that you're going to crunch down into. And really, I guess that's, it's like your own mini feasibility study for the client to help them go. And it's the realistic study. How realistic are they being? As a strategic mortgage broker, you're gauging, are these people, are they overestimating the value of things and, what things might look like? Are they underestimating the actual costs? Overestimating the value. You're trying to get a sense of how realistic they are about what it is they're doing, how much knowledge they actually have about what they're doing. So that's like with the home construction. Then with small time development, it's very similar, because often, you do often, as you know, Cate, you often get people who are thinking about doing it for the first time.
Yeah.
And they actually have no idea often about how hard it is just to get the finance, let alone, to complete the actual build, and, how many sales will they need? Do they need to sell them all? Can they afford to keep one or two? So really,
people do underestimate, don't they?
Yeah.
It's like the Monopoly board.
Yeah.
You should get the greenhouses first before you go getting the hotels.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, have lots of equity if you're doing a small time development.
Yeah.
Because one of the things we'll talk to them about is just, do you realise how much of your overall net wealth is being tied up in this project? And if it doesn't work, if it doesn't pay off, what are the consequences?
Yes. And you talked about overestimating end value and underestimating cost. And I want to throw this one to you, Mike, because people get stars in their eyes, and sometimes architects and draftspeople don't always get it right when they give a back of envelope assessment on build cost. And then you get your friendly QS that comes in and just smashes their dreams. How often do you see people underestimating how much it will cost, and what sort of magnitude is average?
Yeah, look, I don't have data to be able to point to, which is disappointing because I love all that sort of stuff, right? But my brain typically stays in the tax side of things. But look, we do cost engineering projects in concert with the client and the architect, where we'll say, look, this place looks great, but the amount of glazing that you've got here is really blowing over on your budget. And architects aren't really qualified to estimate construction costs.
Yeah, they're like, what do you mean about the glazing? It's a really cool colour. It's on trend. It's going to look great in the magazine.
Yeah, but then it's kind of like, all right, well, the budget for the build was 800 and we're out about 1.7. So, there's something that we've got to do to kind of look at this. Look, it's often the case that we find that the architect has designed something well outside the scope of the budget of the client. And it's often the case that we also see builders tendering for projects which are under what we actually expect it to be. But there can be reasons for that. And one of the typical ones is my cousin owns a concreting plant, or, my brother is a carpenter. And it's like, well, that's okay, but let's get a list of their rates. Let's get a schedule of the rates to say, okay, well, this is what they're supplying it at. Here's a contract that we've signed to show that this is the price and you can do it. And the construction world works a lot like that, right? There's ways that builders can be more competitive because of the connections that they have. So that's okay. You just kind of want to understand that, and that's where an independent expert is necessary. Quantity surveyors are the people that spend their day-to-day knowing and understanding the nuts and bolts of the construction, both materials and labour.
So for our listeners who are just undertaking, whether it's a small-time development or a home build, and let's say they've got an architect and a builder, would you recommend they also enlist a quantity surveyor early on, or wait just for, if they're doing a construction loan, for the quantity surveyor to come into the fold at the bank's whim at each progressive stage of the drawdown? What would you recommend, and why?
With a sophisticated loan, so not a residential loan, but an actual construction loan, the bank's normally going to mandate a quantity surveyor be in the mix. And occasionally you'll see valuers pop their head above the parapet in this space, and I think I've seen too many examples of that being elected from a cost-saving point of view, but they're not adequately qualified to estimate construction values. We don't estimate market values because that's not the area of the world that we understand and specialize in. So with the bank, you might have to engage somebody, but for everyone else, absolutely. It's not just understanding the total cost, it's understanding the program, it's looking at the insurances, it's certifying that people are being paid, and it's also looking at the milestones and maintaining a cost to complete. So it's a estimating piece, but it's also a protection and tracking piece as well.
Okay. And just before we get into gold nuggets, because we need to wrap up. So would you recommend that, the average person building or doing a major renovation on their own home involve a quantity surveyor up front as a sort of protection mechanism against what the builder's putting forward?
Well, with a renovation, it might be such a quick time horizon that there's no real need to sort of have milestone payments or milestone checking, but a sense check can be reasonable to understand, look, this can be done for this point in time. Of course, we can also assess tenders. So there might be 3 tenders, and the best way to do it is for us to provide an estimate broken up in the way that we do it and just basically delete the values, because often, builders will put a tender out and, joinery might include XYZ in their contract, but it's actually in a different space in another contract. So it enables you to compare like for like. But yeah, certainly if it's a complete build or a very extensive renovation, I definitely recommend a QS in the mix.
Yeah. Oh, very good. Awesome. Well, I think we all learned something in this episode, guys. So before we wrap up, let's go to our gold nuggets.
Now it's time for us to go mining for our gold nugget property tip of the day.
So for my gold nugget, there's just 3 things I think are really important to nail. First one is understand exactly what budget you want to work with. Second one is work with someone who will work to your budget. And the third one is have a very good strategic finance person on your side.
I think invest the time in the beginning, make sure that contract is reviewed, because the templated contracts tend to come from HIA, master builders. These are kind of builder style contracts, right? Because those industries advocate for them. So you kind of want to make sure you're getting it right from the beginning. You've got reasonable understanding of the cost, of the program, of your legal protections, of the milestones, of liquidated damages, of retentions, and it's certainly worthwhile investing some extra time and money in the beginning, so you're not halfway through there suffering some of the pain that Melissa has.
Very good. Okay, great. Well, I think that has been a really helpful episode for our listeners and complement some of the previous ones we've done on renovating and subdividing and construction. So until next week, have a great week, everybody, and we'll talk to you soon.
See you next week.